So what if Revelation 11:2 isn't about a future Antichrist or a rebuilt temple? But what if it's pointing to something that already happened? Like the Roman siege of Jerusalem almost 2,000 years ago? Um, Not really saying this is the case for certain, but I definitely think it's worth taking a look at. I don't know why so many people are quick to write off the little season, but if you don't know what I'm talking about, stay tuned so that we can go back and consider the possibility that John wasn't describing events thousands of years into the future, but something unfolding in his own time. Stay tuned, friends. That's what we're going to get into today. Welcome back to Encounter Truth, where we challenge the status quo. And I'm your host, Chris. And today, we're going to look at Revelation 11:2, because I believe it's not about a future Antichrist. I believe Antichrist was a spirit that inhabited the people of that time to fulfill, again, the role of the enemy, who I believe we're in a little season as of right now. Revelation 11:2 is not about a third temple. It's about what already happened. And we're going to take a look at that as well. Rome trampled Jerusalem for exactly 42 months, just as Jesus and John both prophesied. And the kingdom here, to follow the temple, wasn't the end of the story. It was the final warning that the kingdom had come. And what happens is that most Christians today have only heard of futurism, timelines and Antichrist, a coming tribulation. Yet the early church, they weren't looking forward to something. They were looking at the very time at hand, the present time then. Men like Eusebius, Jerome, Athanasius, they saw Matthew 24 and Daniel 9 as something that already occurred, already happened. And what we want to look at is really some historical writings of Josephus. I believe he has some very interesting writings that parallel exactly what happened here. And looking at Revelation 11:2, that says, "But the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months." Now, obviously, from the way I used to view the book of Revelation, and Daniel for that matter, and Ezekiel, a lot of these end times prophecies known as eschatology, very cryptic, coded, if you will. You needed some type of deep understanding of Revelation in order to decode its allegory or symbolism. And what I believe is this is where things get really interesting, because when I started reading the Bible for myself out of the futuristic view, out of the dispensationalist type view of a rapture theory, because it's interesting, we don't ever see people being raptured, right? I think if you were to say that, the only Elijah was taken up by a whirlwind, Enoch, and he walked with God and was no more, even Philip was translated after him immersing the eunuch. It's very interesting, right? But anyway, I digress. The Roman-Jewish War lasted around 3.5 years, which is about 42 months. And it started in 66 AD and ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year of 70 AD, or the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And when we really take that in consideration, could it be that this treading underfoot was fulfilled during that war? And I believe this is where it gets very interesting when we look at this in light of what Josephus had wrote. He was a Jewish historian who lived through the war and wrote a 7-volume history called The Wars of the Jews. He describes the rebellion in 66 AD, the siege of Jerusalem, and the temple being burned in August 70 AD. And he estimated that there was over 1 million deaths, and I believe almost 100,000 captives during that time. So could John's vision and Josephus's historical record be describing the same event from two different perspectives? And likewise, Jesus had said in Luke 21 that Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive. That sounds exactly just like what I read about Josephus's historical record on what he noted, that he estimated over 1 million deaths. Well, Jesus is saying here that many will fall by the sword and that there will be captives. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. Well, in Hebrew, Gentiles is goyim, means nations. The Rome, well, that was the nations. until the end, or until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Daniel 9 ends with the prophecy of the coming prince who would destroy the city and sanctuary. I haven't done my video yet on the different Roman emperors, but I do believe that a lot of the early church fathers looked at Nero, Domitian, Caligula, even Titus, as these antichrists, if you will, who heavily persecuted the followers of Jesus Christ in that day. Matthew 24 includes warnings that many connect with the fall of Jerusalem. So we want to look at, are any of these passages possibly connected? And I believe that's where it gets really interesting when we see how they line up. Because Revelation 11:2 speaks of 42 months. Josephus says that the war lasted 3.5 years. Matthew 24:2 says the temple would be left with not one stone upon another. Josephus says the temple was razed to the ground. I believe there's even a time where Mark Twain had mentioned on his trip to Palestine that there was no evidence of a city ever being there. And again, going back to Luke 21:24, where it says that the city would be trampled by Gentiles, Josephus says that the Romans had set fire to everything during that time. And when we take in consideration of what that might look like, of a city being totally under siege and encamped around, and Josephus, writing down in his record that the Romans set fire to everything, I don't believe it's just a coincidence. I do believe that this is something that did happen. At the start of the war, Josephus records this in his book Wars of the Jews, book 2, chapters 14 through 77. In 66 AD, rebellion begins in Judea under Roman occupation. Then we have the siege of Jerusalem, book 5. The Romans encircle and overtake the city, and then trampling of the city, Romans set fire to the temple and destroy Jerusalem. And the length of the war was roughly 3.5 years, which aligns with 42 months or 1,260 days. And he says in his book of the wars in book 6, chapter 9, now the number of those that perished during the whole siege was 1,100,000. The multitude of those that were carried captive during the war was about 97,000, about 100,000. So obviously, the temple was burned in August of 70 AD. The siege lasted several years with Roman control dominating the city. The Gentiles, or the Romans, literally trampled the city, Jerusalem, and the temple, fulfilling Yeshua or Jesus' words in Luke 21 and Revelation 11. Some of what the early church fathers had also believed. We have early leaders and historians like Eusebius and Jerome, because they also seem to believe that these prophecies were fulfilled in the first century. They didn't look to Revelation or Matthew 24 as future events. They actually saw them as warnings that came to pass with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So could it be that they were closer to the truth than many modern day interpreters? And what were some of the things that the apostles said about the timing of 70 AD and the end times? That is also something that's really interesting. When we do see that Revelation 1:1 says things which must shortly come to pass. A couple of verses later in verse 3, the time is at hand. 1 Peter 4:7, the end of all things is at hand. Hebrews 10:37, he that shall come will come and will not tarry. Then a very interesting verse by Paul in Colossians 1:23 saying that the gospel had already been preached to every creature under heaven. And there's some other supporting writings, right, by Tacitus, who is a Roman historian. He also documented the destruction of Jerusalem and the brutality of Titus's campaign through the Roman lens, a Roman perspective. Again, we mentioned Eusebius, an early church historian, approximately 300 AD, who cites Josephus and also references the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24 through the fall of Jerusalem. And, while Revelation 11:2 prophesies the trampling, Josephus records the fulfillment. The 42 months is really not symbolic or future, because it was fulfilled in detail from mid-66 AD to 70 AD, just as John and Jesus both said it would happen. And just to kind of read you some history from Josephus' books, Wars of the Jews, in book 6, chapter 4, closely parallels with Revelation 11:2. Again, Revelation 11:2, the holy city shall they tread under the foot 42 months. Book 6, chapter 4 says, the city was now entirely under the power of those that had destroyed it. Titus gave orders to raise the city to its foundations. Matthew 24:2, when Jesus says, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. In book 7, chapter 1 of Josephus's The Wars of the Jews, he says, now as to the rest of the wall, it was so thoroughly laid, even with the ground by those that dug it up, it appeared there had never been a city there. Very interesting. In Luke 21:24, as we've read, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. Well, in book 6, chapters 8 and 9 of Wars of the Jews, Josephus cites the Romans set the temple on fire. All the cloisters about it were burning, and the city was now full of dead bodies. Matthew 24:21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world. Well, in book 5, chapter 12 of Wars of the Jews, Josephus quotes, no other city ever suffered such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness. Matthew 24:16, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Book 2 of Wars of the Jews, many of the Jews ran away from the city, especially after it was enclosed, but those who stayed either were slaughtered or starved. And going back to the other one that I had quoted, for then shall be a great tribulation of Matthew 24:21, and comparing that to Josephus's book 5, chapter 12, that no other city ever suffered such miseries. It's interesting because Jesus does quote in Matthew 10:15 and chapter 11, he says that it will be more bearable or more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for certain cities or individuals who have rejected him or his teachings. And so when we think of that in lieu of AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, very interesting how he makes these parallels. And Luke 19, verse 43 through 44, Jesus says that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee and compass thee round. Well, Josephus also says in book 5, chapter 12, that Titus ordered a wall to be built around the entire city to cut off all aid so that no one could escape that protection. Just a lot of interesting observations here that the treading of the holy city for 42 months is a literal fulfillment from mid-66 AD to 70 AD. The Romans, who were the Gentiles, desecrated the temple, murdered over 1 million Jews, and left the city in ruins. Both Jesus and John's specific words are confirmed by an unbelieving Jewish historian, and this proves that Revelation is not only spiritual, but it's deeply rooted in historical reality, if that we just have the eyes to see this. And it's just, Revelation 1, the time is at hand, shortly come to pass. The revelation of Jesus Christ to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass, for the time is at hand. These are not throwaway phrases. John was clearly writing to real people in real time about events that would unfold very, very soon, not 2,000 plus years later. If shortly doesn't mean shortly, and at hand doesn't mean at hand, then, words really mean nothing. We're just throwing them out. Revelation 1:7, behold, he cometh with the clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him. That's a direct audience targeting. Who pierced him? Well, the first century generation, both Jewish leaders and Roman soldiers. John says they would witness this judgment. That mirrors Jesus' own words in Matthew 26, verse 64. Hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. When he was speaking to Caiaphas, he was speaking to the Sanhedrin, not to people 2,000 years later. And what's also interesting about this is in Colossians 1:3, the gospel had already been preached to every creature under heaven, as Paul says. The gospel which was preached to every creature is under heaven. That fulfilled Jesus' own words in Matthew 24:14 when he said that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end shall come. And at that time, the Roman ruled the whole known world. And by AD 60s, Paul says that mission was complete. What about the audience in AD 65? Hold fast, the end is at hand. That's the heartbeat of these first century letters that were being circulated. The end of all things is at hand, 1 Peter 4:7. Yet a little while, and he that shall come will come and will not tarry, Hebrews 10:37. 1 John 2:18, it is the last time. This is prophetic urgency, because as we already seen, Peter, Paul, and John were not giving false hope. They were warning of coming judgment that culminated in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple. And we really do need a study to show ourselves approved, rightly dividing the word of truth. And I'm sure I'll catch some flack here, but when Paul says this in 2 Timothy 2:15, yes, we must really understand what is the context, what is the time frame, and the audience that Jesus was speaking to. If we really ignore this audience relevance, we rip prophecy out of its fulfillment window and invent futuristic timelines based upon the lens in which we see it as the rapture and dispensationalism. So if John says that these things must shortly come to pass, and Jesus says this generation will not pass, and Paul says the gospel had already been preached to all nations, then why are we still awaiting for things that already happened? The early believers weren't clinging to charts and timelines, they were clinging to God's promises. They weren't told to watch for a 7-year tribulation or a one world government. They were told to endure, because judgment was coming soon, and it did. And we see that. And when we go back and have an understanding of this Roman-Jewish war that took place here, the holy city shall they tread underfoot 40 and 2 months, Revelation 11:2. When we really look at this, like the start of the war in mid-66, the siege of Jerusalem in early 67, and the destruction of the temple 70 AD, that's exactly 42 months, 3.5 years, as we had seen earlier. This really happened. We can't just overlook this, as I had done so many years of my life reading the book of Revelation, not understanding exactly how to interpret it because I was looking at it with the wrong view. I was looking at it through a lens of this dispensationalist type teaching or futurist type teaching without even realizing it. And could the writers of the New Testament letters have been pointing to something their own generation would see? Because if the temple system was judged and dismantled in 70 AD, and if the old covenant truly came to an end with that event, then maybe the kingdom isn't something we're waiting for. Maybe the kingdom already came through Christ, and we're living in the age that they were pointing toward. Luke 17 does say that the kingdom of God is within you. And I'm not here to force a conclusion. I'm here, again, help us to challenge the status quo. We really look at things and question the narrative, as Contend for the Faith channel would say on their podcast. Because if we've been told that Revelation is entirely about our future, and yet the timing, the context, and the historical record point back to the 1st century, then maybe it's time to revisit what we think we know, without looking at it through the lens of futurism or dispensationalism. I'm not asking you to agree with me. Just consider the possibility and read your Bible for yourself with an open mind, because maybe, just maybe, we're not waiting for the kingdom. Maybe it's already here, and we are in the little season. That's what I really believe we should put under the microscope and challenge here. The Roman siege of Jerusalem that occurred almost 2,000 years ago. It's definitely worth looking at, to reconsider the possibility that John wasn't describing events that would occur 2,000 years later in the future, but something that was unfolding in his own time. And with that being said, I want to thank you for watching the video. Make sure to tune in next week and leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this message. Just get it out there. Help the algorithms put this in front of more people to raise awareness of what's really going on, so that we can wake people up in their spiritual slumber. Again, challenge the status quo. And